Hey everyone, Livewire Free is now available. It just got announced at Laracon US by Caleb. There are a ton of amazing new features, so let's take a look and dive in. Let's take a look at the new Navigate feature. So if you ever work with Inertia or React, then you're probably familiar with a single page application. And when you navigate between pages, it feels like it's instant. Now with Livewire, components are reactive, but when you're switching between pages, you still have the browser refresh. And now in the V3, there's a new Navigate directive, which introduces the same kind of feel that you have with a single page application. So what I've got here is a little demo application where we have a bunch of different pages, and we're gonna check out the new Navigate feature and see what the difference is and how it works. So what you can see here is when I start to navigate between pages is that the browser completely reloads the page. So this is how things worked in V2. With V3, we can add the Wire Navigate directive to our navigation, which will ensure that we get a single page application effect. Let's take a look. So let's switch to our editor and open up our navigation file. Here you can see that I have all the links defined to all our different pages. So in order to enable the Navigate feature, all I have to do is add Wire Navigate to each of these links. So if we switch back to our browser and we start navigating between pages, you can see that it feels instant. We even get a nice loading indicator whenever we navigate to a page that takes a bit longer to load. There's a loading bar at the top of the screen and there's a little loading indicator on the right side. This is something you can turn off, by the way. So how does this work? Well, Livewire keeps track of the mouse down event, and it will prevent the browser from actually visiting the page that you're clicking. Instead, it will do a request in the background and at the same time show a loading bar at the top of the page. And once the page is done, it replaces the actual content of the HTML whenever you release your mouse. Pretty neat, right? Besides the mouse down event, there's also an option to have it trigger on hover. This is cool for navigation menus like you see up here. So to enable it, we simply add .hover. That's it. Now, Livewire will trigger a request in the background whenever someone hovers one of these URLs. So the hover modifier may increase the server usage because it's firing off a bunch more requests. Livewire does add like a 60 millisecond wait before prefetching to mitigate some of the effects that might occur because of the hover. But be cautious when using it, especially when you have like a lot of URLs. Now, another cool feature related to Wire Navigate is the persist directive. So you might imagine that you have like a video on your website and you want to have like a embedded like mini player on the bottom right corner of your browser. And when you navigate between pages, you want the video to keep on playing. So right now, when you would do this, whenever you would navigate between pages, it would actually reload the video. So all we need to prevent this is add the persist directive. And it's super easy. Let's switch back to our editor and wrap our video in the persist directive. The persist directive expects a key, which is a unique identifier which Livewire keeps track of, which element should be preserved on the page. So let's add that and let's move back to our browser, play the video. And as you can see, once I start navigating between pages, the video stays where it was and it keeps on playing. Now you might think, well, this is pretty cool, but how does it work when I use different pieces of JavaScript around my application? Well, there are a few things you have to take into account. First, script tags within the head tag are loaded once. So if you have two different JavaScript files on two separate pages, each of them will be loaded and evaluated once. So as you can see, I added a hello world alert and that's getting fired on the initial page load, but when I start navigating between additional pages, I don't get the alert a second time. Let's add a second script tag and let's give it a hello world 2 alert. When I switch to the browser and when I start navigating, you'll see that I only get the hello world 2 alert and not the initial one. So again, script tags are only initialized and evaluated once when they're inside the head tag. So one of the downsides, of course, is when you have a piece of JavaScript and the user still has an active session open and you deploy a new version of your application at the same time, he or she is still getting the old JavaScript. So as you can see in this example, I have a JavaScript file with build version 1 and it fired off an alert whenever I loaded the initial page. Now I'm going to change the build version to free, and I'm going to add the data navigate track attribute to our script tag. And now when I go to a new page, you can see that the entire page just got reloaded and the alert was triggered once again. So this is a cool feature to make sure that your assets or the browser is reloaded whenever you change to a different version. So what about script tags that are inside the body tag? Well, these are evaluated every time a page loads. So let's clean this up a bit and let's add an alert. And now you can see every time I navigate between a page, it will fire off the alert. Now, in some cases, you might think like, hey, I want this JavaScript tag on my page, but I only want it to run once the entire session. So there's an attribute for that as well. You can add data navigate once. So this will ensure that the script is evaluated once while navigating between pages. Okay, let's move on to lazy loading Livewire components. So imagine you have a dashboard and there are some statistics that you want to show, but they take a bit of time to calculate and for them to show up. So right now, the entire page would be loaded a bit slower because it's waiting for all the components to be ready. So with the new lazy attribute, you can ensure that a component doesn't lower the response time when loading your page. The component will sit there and it will load in the background and it will appear once it's done loading. By default, it won't show anything while it's loading in the background. But if you want, you can add a placeholder. Simply open up the component and add a method called placeholder. You can return the HTML inline or return a blade view, and this placeholder will appear while your component is loading. So let's take a look. When we refresh the page, you can see that we now get a nice Livewire animation, and after 2 seconds, the component will appear. Next up, we got Reactive Properties. So on this page here, I have an example of a users list and a recently created users list. These are two separate components. Well, actually, the recent created list is a child component. And by default, when we would add a new user, the recently created component does not know a new user got added. So in this example, if we add a new user, you can see that the list did not get updated. Now, if we take a quick look at the code, you can see that we're simply looping through our users and that there's a second recent users component where we pass along the collection of users. In the recent users component, you can see that we accept the users as an attribute. And in the blade view, you can see that we simply sorting the users collection by the created add date and showing the users in that order. So in order to make the recently created users list update whenever we add a new user is by making a property on a component reactive. We can do so by simply using the reactive attribute. So here we got our collection of users and we simply add the reactive attribute. That's it. Let's move back to the browser. Click add new user. And as you can see, now our child components got updated whenever we add a new user. Okay, let's move on to the next feature, which is called Modables. So in this example, I have a form where you can create a new post and we got a title, we got some content and a create post button. Now let's assume that our content, our text area is some fancy Livewire input component. So in V2, it was quite difficult to make a component and behave as an actual model. Now with V3, you can make a component modable. So that means that you can set wire model and it will actually proxy through that value to our component. Let me just show you, it makes more sense. So as you can see here, we're looping through our post. We got a form here. We got two input fields. We got our title and our body. And in this case, we're going to replace our text area with a new component. So our post components look like this. We got a title, we got a body. Whenever we hit the button, we create a new post and we reset the properties. So let's create a new Livewire component called form/text area. So let's insert our Livewire text area component right here. And let's move the HTML into our component view. Okay, perfect. Now this text area has become generic, so wire model body doesn't make sense. So let's change this into wire model value instead. So now we add wire model body to our text area and give this a try in the browser. you will see that it did not work. One, the body did not get included when the post was created, and the form did not reset. So how to make a component modable is simply by adding a public property that contains the value, in this case, the value of our text area. Next, we add a new Livewire attribute, which is called Modable. So we give it another try and enter our title and our content and attempt to create a new post. You can see that this time it did work. So that's pretty cool, right? Because our Livewire component is now able to react as a model. So if you have very complex components and that are included in your form, this is a very good way to abstract logic into a component, but make it behave as it were an actual model inside a form, if that makes sense. So another new feature in Livewire 3 is the ability to lock public properties. So let's say, for example, that you have a public property called ID. This ID is something that you do not want users to change, because if you used Livewire before, you probably know that public means public. To give you an example, we can use the console and use the Livewire object to manipulate the public properties. For example, we can change the title, or we can change the ID and submit the form. So this would allow an attacker to manipulate data before submitting a form, which could lead to unwanted behavior, of course. Now, in Livewire 3, you can add a locked attribute. So let's give it a try. Let's go back to our components and add the locked attribute. Now we switch back to the browser. We again use the global Livewire object to find the component, and we'll change the title or the ID, and we'll try to create a post again. This time you'll see that we'll get an exception being thrown because we're trying to modify a public property that has been locked. So if you've ever built a web application, you probably have dealt with forms. And in Livewire 3, there are a bunch of new utilities that make it easier to deal with form submission, validation, abstracting away logic. So let's take a look at what has changed. Let's start off with validation. In V2, you would have to create a method or set a public property that would contain the rules for each and every public property that you would like to have validated. Now in V3, you can use an attribute on the property to set the validation rules that you want. So let's use the rule attribute to make the title required. And let's do the same for the body, but also set a minimum of 20 characters. Now all we have to do is call this validate on the create method. Now we switch to a browser and we try to create a new post. You can see that nothing happens. This is because the validation is stopping the post from being created, but we haven't implemented any errors to be shown yet. So let's quickly add some error reporting so we can see our error for our title and our body. And if you give this another go, you can see that we now get the message saying that the title is required and the body is required as well. Perfect. Let's also verify that the actual creation of posts also still works. So let's type a title and enter some text here and attempt to create a new post. As you can see, the character validation is also working. So let's add an additional few characters. And there we go. Our post just got added to the database. So this is pretty cool, but there's even better feature. You can now extract this logic into form objects. This is especially useful when you're working with larger forms and you have to deal with a lot of properties. But it basically allows you to abstract the rules, but even also the creation of your models into a separate object. So you use the Livewire form command to create a new form. So let's do that right now. And we'll call it post form. Let's remove the validation rules and set a public property that is equal to the post form object. And let's move the validation rules into our post form object. Now we also need to make sure that we update our references. So instead of referencing this title, we need to make sure that everything is referencing this form. So let's make sure that we update our models as well inside our blade view. Okay, let's quickly try this in the browser. And there we go. All the validation rules still work. Now, besides the validation rules, we can also move other logic in these objects as well. For example, the creation of our models. So let's create a public method called store, and we'll replicate the same behavior. So we'll say post, create, and we'll pass all the data. And with all the data, I mean all public properties defined on this form object. So in this case, it will only return title and body. Now we can move back to our post component and remove the creation of the model like we did earlier. And instead, we'll reference our form object and call the store method. So now the validation and the storing of this form is abstracted into our form object. Okay, let's move on to another feature, which is called teleport. So you probably built an application where you have to deal with a modal or like a dialogue. And with Livewire v3, there's a new teleport directive, which makes building these kinds of forms quite easy because it allows you to teleport content from a component to outside of your component, if that makes sense. Let's dive into the code and let me explain how this works. So here we got our settings page. So let's create a button that will open up our modal, and we're going to set an add click listener, which is Alpine, and we'll set the show modal value to true. We'll later define this value in our app layout. Now within the same component, we might want to define what the contents of this modal should be. So now let's use the teleport directive. The teleport directive accepts one parameter, and this parameter is a query selector, which is basically saying, hey, I want this content to be teleported to this element or ID within the DOM. So let's reference modal body in this example. Make sure that we end our directive, and inside this directive we can add the contents for our modal. So in this example, let's just create a simple div with a title saying my settings modal. Now our button was setting a show modal property to true. We still have to define it, so let's add an X data property to our body class and set show modal to false by default. Now we want to create some sort of container for our modal. So this is going to live in our layout. So this is only going to be defined once. And basically, anytime we use the teleport directive, the contents is going to be teleported over to this little section that we've defined in our app layout. So in our example, we got our settings components with our settings blade. That's where we defined the contents of the settings modal, and we're basically going to teleport the contents to this div that we just defined just here. So let's give it some basic markup. So we got our modal backdrop. Let's make sure that it's a fixed div that has some height, some width, a nice background. And then we'll define our modal body as well, which is going to be a simple div with a white background, some shadows, some rounded corners, all the good stuff. And this is where the contents will be teleported to, because we referenced ID is equal to modal body. And if you recall, inside our settings blade, we've set the add teleport directive query selector to modal dash body. So when we now click the button, we should expect to have the show modal property set to true and the contents being teleported into the modal body div. So let's give it a try. And there you go. Our content was teleported over to the modal that we've set on our layout. So this is pretty cool. I think it's a great addition to Livewire to make it easier to work with these types of components like modals or slide overs. There's one thing to be aware of though, is you must always teleport outside of the component. So what we did just here, teleporting contents to a div that lives on the body tag, that's fine, but you cannot teleport to a different Livewire component because on subsequent request, that code will be removed. So these are some of the major new features in Livewire version 3, but this is definitely not all, so be sure to check out the documentation and read up on all new features and changes. This is still a beta release, so we might see some additional changes before the stable release ships, but nevertheless, let's take a look at the upgrade process. I have a ton of Livewire applications, and I thought it would be pretty great if some of these things could be automated. So I've been contributing to an upgrade command that will speed up the migration process. It's still work in progress, and not everything has been automated, but it will definitely save you some time. Oh, and by the way, in case you're a regular Expression fan, feel free to submit a PR with some additional upgrade automations. Anyways, let's dive in and take a look at what happens when we run the Livewire upgrade command. So you will see that this command will take a step-by-step approach and run us through the migration process from version 2 to version 3. Files will be modified in place, so make sure that you have a backup of your project before continuing. It helps to have Git installed so you can easily review all the changes afterwards. So one significant change is that all wire models are now deferred by default. So you have to ensure that the .live modifier is added to each and every model if you want to maintain the live effect. So whenever you do a keystroke down, that it will send off a request. At the same time, this means that all wire model.defer directives have to be changed to wire model without the .defer. As you can see, this command will automate all the changes. It will go through all your blade files and make the required changes. Okay, let's move on. Another change is that the lazy modifier has been changed to .blur. So simply press enter and all occurrences will be updated for you. So similar to our models, entangle directive is now deferred by default as well. So you need to ensure that it has the .live modifier. And in case you're using this in your JavaScript, you need to make sure that it has a second parameter and that it has been set to true. Again, everything is automated, so simply press enter and all occurrences will be updated for you. Given the entangle directive is now deferred by default, we can remove the defer modifier from all occurrences. The prefetch modifier from the click directive has been removed, so simply press enter and remove all those occurrences. Next, we got Livewire load, which has been changed to Livewire init. So in version 2, you were probably used to using this emit to dispatch events, or using this dispatch browser events. In version 3, this all has changed. You now use this dispatch to emit events. So this means all assertion helpers also need to be updated. And that's what we'll do right now. And please be aware the concept of emitting events up has been removed. So all automatic replacements have been done. But let's take a look at some steps that you might want to update manually. For example, in version 3, the config has been updated. So if you haven't published it, then that's fine. If you have published your config file, be sure to check and make sure that you updated it with all the appropriate new configuration options. And if you're wondering, what are these new added options and why are some of these options removed? Check out the documentation and everything is explained there. So another significant change with version 3 is that it now ships with Alpine.js, and this is required for Livewire to function. So in version 2, Alpine.js was not a dependency, now it is. And Alpine.js is bundled with all the Livewire JavaScript as well. So you need to make sure that you remove any instances that you've added yourself. So whether it be a CDN or when you're importing Alpine.js manually, be sure to remove any of these references. The version of Alpine.js that is bundled with Livewire also includes most of Alpine's plugins, meaning intersect, collapse, persist, morph, focus, and mask. So if you were loading any of these plugins manually, you can remove those references as well. In case you were loading Alpine inside your JavaScript itself, like in a ESM module, in that case, you can use the import function and import Livewire and Alpine as shown here on your screen. You can register any of your custom Alpine plugins and call Livewire start, which will start Alpine and Livewire. So as mentioned earlier, the concept of emitting events and dispatching browser events have all been consolidated into a single method called dispatch. So you need to make sure that you update all these references. So emit becomes dispatch, emit to, emit self becomes dispatch as well, but you add a to method or a self method, so you still get the same functionality. And one very significant change is that it now requires named parameters. So here you can see that we're emitting event post created with the post ID. Now you need to add a named parameter called post ID and pass in the post ID. That's quite a significant change, so be sure to double check that you've updated this everywhere. This, of course, also applies to any of the helpers that you were using directly in your Blade files, like the emit helper. This has become dispatch as well. And again, the emit up concept has been removed entirely, so make sure that any of these references are removed, as events are not dispatched as a browser event, and therefore they bubble up by default. And finally, our compiled views are cleared. So we just reviewed quite a big chunk of the upgrade process from version 2 to version 3. There are still some things to be automated, but I expect when we're approaching the stable release, more and more of these upgrade steps will be automated. Feel free to submit a PR if you think like, hey, I want to make this specific step automated. So while we're in beta, I highly recommend that you check out the documentation for the upgrade process as well, because that's probably going to be more up to date than this command. And that was it. Thank you so much for watching and stay tuned for more.